Welcome back to the Master System, where we teach the scriptures, but we never twist them. We are continuing to establish the importunity motif. The importunity motif. And it wouldn't be a stretch to say this one is for the dogs. But there's something that we should know about dogs. It is not the size of the dog in the fight. It's the size of the fight in the dog. And this dog had a lot of fight. The old wives say that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. If that one's true, then this dog must have learned these tricks as a pup. In fact, the first trick it ever learned was to beg food from its master. As time went by and its cuteness wore off, it turned to more desperate measures. The ravished dog would covertly lie in wait around the dinner table, ready to pounce on any crumbs that fell to the floor, like a wake of vultures dropping from the sky to feast on a newly discovered carcass. Entertained by the show that their pet made of these goings-on, the children would purposely drop scraps of food and watch with amusement as the hungered canine would attack and devour the cast-off morsels. As it grew up, it became enough of a show dog to get whatever it wanted, whenever it wanted it, simply by amusing people with circus acts of tomfoolery. Eventually, the underdog took home the trophy for best in show. Let's take a look. She was not a domestic dog. Mark singled her out as a foreigner. The woman was a Greek, a Syro-Phoenician by birth, and she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. As it was, this Syro-Phoenician mutt had no right to the things for which she was asking. Notwithstanding, the desperate mother pleaded with the great deliverer, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely demon-possessed." This woman's daughter did not just have a case of the demons. She had a severe case of the demons. Her first cry for help met with just about as much disappointment as could be expected in this already hopeless situation. But he answered her not a word. Talk about divine indifference. Jesus seemed entirely uninterested in ridding her child of the severe case of the demons. So much so, he did not even dignify her with a response. Undoubtedly, the deliverer would have shaken off many comers by this show of indifference. Unfortunately, as many as would walk away at this point would walk away empty-handed. John said, "If we know that he hears us in whatever we ask, then we know that we have the requests which we have asked from him." Well, there's only one surefire way of making sure that God hears us. You have to squeak like a rusty wheel in desperate need of oil. Squeaking is exactly the recourse this wheel decided to take. Let's take a look. If she could not get a response from the hand of deliverance, she figured she might be able to get a response from one of his fingers. Undeterred, she went after his followers, pestering and pestering them until they were so worn out by her persistent pleas, they came and begged the hand to do something for her or with her, even if it just meant ushering her out the door. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she cries out after us." Even put through different lips, her second request was more clearly denied than the first. The reason? She was from the wrong side of the tracks. Thinking he could get them to point the way to the door for the lowly Canaanite, he explained to his fingers, "I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." This good shepherd was not sent to the children of Ham. He was assigned to the children of Abraham. Thus, the seed of Abraham wished that this mutt, who had wandered onto his property, would just bugger off gently into that good night. After being ignored, most people would have simply given up. The rest of the fold, those who merely had good faith, they would have thrown in the towel after he had made his intentions of doing nothing a little more clear. But for this woman of great faith, her motivation was given a quick shot in the arm. At first, her plea had escaped the notice of the hand of deliverance. At least now she had arrested his attention. And this tiny movement towards acquiescence gave the tale enough energy in the form of hope to fuel its wagging of the dog. Let's take a look. And wag it did, propelling the mangy mutt right past the fingers swiftly into the palm of deliverance. Then she came and worshipped him, saying, "Lord, help me." She began this encounter by walking on eggshells. At first, it was not abundantly clear how badly she even wanted her child's deliverance. But the more resolute her new master became in denying her request, the more adamant she became about getting exactly what she wanted. Maybe, just maybe, this is the kind of stubbornly persistent faith it takes to get one's grubby little hands into heaven's cupboards. Notwithstanding these valiant efforts, Jesus showed no sign of giving in. He met her third and most adamant request with an even more adamant denial. This woman was now acting like a stray dog that kept getting into the garbage bins. Well, if the homeowner could not prevent her from spreading the mess across the yard, he was at least resolved to prevent her from coming in the house and pilfering the family's dinner. Let's take a look. He gave what proved to be his final remonstrance. "It is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs." This ravished tailwagger had come sniffing around the dinner table, hoping to swipe something off the plate of one of Abraham's children. When she had almost gotten her grubby little paws on something, she was caught red-handed and sternly reprimanded. In this instance, the bread of life was intent on preserving himself for the rightful heirs. After all, they were the descendants of those who cared so much about their bread in the wilderness. They valued it so greatly that they left it to dry rot in the desert, where not many years later their scorched bodies would do the same. Yet, the bread of life was not intent on punishing this generation for the sins of their fathers. Instead, he was protecting the children's bread from this stray ball of fur, who had moseyed on in to munch on it. Let's take a look. The best thing about being a dog is that every dog has her day. And she decided that this was hers. So she took the bait, cast out her hook, and she reeled in the cast-offs of the children of Abraham. Like a well-trained show dog on its hind legs, hanging its front paws in the air to signify its position as a beggar. She supplicated to him one more time, arguing, "Yes, Lord, yet even the little dogs eat the crumbs which fall from their master's table." Finding that her pedigree did not fit the bill, when it came time to show her hand, she played the faith card. It turned into a game of war, where one player kept taking the other's high cards with her aces. She trumped every denial with another request. For every reason he had not to acquiesce, she had another reason why he should. Eventually, someone had to give in, lest the two should remain forever seated at a game that has no end. How long does the Lord have to ignore you before you quit squealing? How many times and in how many ways does he have to say no before you decide to walk away empty-handed? This woman decided that she was going to drive him crazy with her constant requests, litter his day with misery until he decided to end hers. This relentless woman passed the test of denial by pounding his ears with an entourage of requests. For every denial, she had an equal and opposite rebuttal. She found reason after reason why Jesus should answer her. How did the bread of life respond? Let's take a look. Jesus did not have the woman removed from his presence. He had her problem removed from her life. Seeing that her resolve would not be broken, Jesus finally acquiesced. Not unlike the unjust judge who ultimately said, "This woman is driving me crazy. I'm going to see that she gets justice because she is wearing me out with her constant requests." Not at all unlike the unjust judge. He tried ignoring her. He tried denying her. He tried denying her again. But the fourth time was the charm for the begging show dog. Commending her performance, he said, "O woman, great is your faith. Let it be to you as you desire." As soon as those words left his lips, the severe demon left her daughter. The bread of life did not give her the crumbs. He gave her the homemade loaves. He did as much for the dog as he did for any of the children. And if you think about it, Jesus was not guarding this bread from the Syrophoenician woman. He was guarding it for her. He just didn't realize she was a true daughter of Abraham until she showed him. She showed him what her father showed his father 1,800 years before. And then he saw the family resemblance. Let's take a look at our precept. This one's called Best in Show. It says, there's no denying denial's pretty rough, but clever canines call the master's bluff. They know that no can't possibly mean no, for dogs whose dogged tricks are best in show. The master said, great is your faith. Anyone can ask once. Good faith may even ask twice or thrice. But great faith has been trained to keep on asking until the master turns and says, let it be to you as you desire. And if you desire to be best in show, you should know this. There is no denying that denial's pretty rough, but clever canines call the master's bluff. They know that no can't possibly mean no, for dogs whose dogged tricks are best in show. In the face of denial, great faith always has its arguments. If it's not this, then it is that. If it is neither this nor that, then it must be something else. The only way to get great faith to shut up is to give it what it wants. The only way for the master to have the last word is for him to say yes. And this brings us to our last precept. Let's take a look. This one's called affirmative reaction. It says, the final answer is always yes to those who refuse to take no. The answer is yes. 2 Corinthians 1:20 gives us the answer. It says, for all the promises of God are in him, yes, and in him, amen, to the glory of God through us. Every promise is answered yes in Christ Jesus. If we know the answer's yes, then there's no good reason why we should quit asking until we receive. And this is why we never give up. This is why we always have an affirmative reaction. Because we know the final answer is always yes to those who refuse to take no. Jesus said, everyone who keeps on asking receives. You never have to worry about God denying your request, because everyone who keeps on asking receives. We must rewire every lofty thing to match those words. Everyone who keeps on asking receives. Do you know what a panacea is? That means a cure-all. Well, if there was one verse in the Bible that was a panacea for every doubt you could ever have, that's the one. Everyone who keeps on asking receives. You should replace every file of doubt with that gem of eternal truth. We talk about mind renewal. Well, that's how you do it. When it comes to believing God for your request, that word sword will demolish every argument that's raised against the knowledge of God. It will strike down any argument, and it will extinguish every fiery dart of the wicked one. No matter what the tempter says, your response is this: I'm going to keep on asking, because everyone who keeps on asking receives. That's the affirmative reaction. I'm just going to keep on asking, because everyone who keeps on asking receives. And if what you're doing is asking for another example, then that request is also granted. Let's take a look. So if you need an incentive to keep watching, we're going to look at the only place in the Bible where Jesus guarantees we can speed up the answer to our requests. So this is probably the million-dollar question. Why does it take so long for God to answer us sometimes? What is he doing up there in heaven? Well, the time has come for us to establish the divine indifference motif. The divine indifference motif. We first saw this at the big fat Jewish wedding. Jesus asked Mary, he said, "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me?" We saw this again in the last example. The Syrophoenician woman, she entered her plea. At first, Jesus flat out ignored her. Another case of divine indifference. Divine indifference is when God doesn't exactly say no, but at the same time, he doesn't seem overly concerned with our petition. The judge in our next story definitely displays this indifference. In this example, Jesus is giving us a picture of how prayer works. And if we can accept the fact, might be hard for some of us, but if we can accept the fact that at least sometimes God is like this insensitive judge, then we can learn a valuable lesson here. We can read this parable as a behind-the-scenes look into God's decision-making process. And that's how I suggest we read this. Here's why. If we give careful attention to Jesus' teachings, then we can find out the reasons why requests get answered. Like the friend who had the late-night guest. Jesus made it very clear there. He said it's not because of friendship, but because of his importunity. And that word can mean persistence to the point of annoyance. We'll definitely see that here. But remember, there are always two ditches. Always two ditches. We never want to go too far in one direction. So we don't want to end up praying like the heathen pray. They think that they will be heard for their many words. God is not going to respond to vain repetitions. Okay, so we're not looking for chanting. We're not looking to read a 2,000-word prayer out of a prayer book. Jesus told us, he said, don't be vain in your repetitions like the heathen do, who think that they will be heard for their many words. So we don't want to do that. But at the same time, you don't want to go too far to the extreme with that, because the Bible never says not to repeat your request. As a matter of fact, in this example, Jesus is going to tell us to cry out day and night. Well, there's going to be some repetition then. Just make sure that it's not in vain. That means that you feel it, that it comes from the heart, that there's some passion involved. Not mindless repetition. The Bible never discourages persistent prayer. For example, God sent Daniel his answer right away, but Daniel kept asking. But the angel didn't reprimand him. He explained the delay and delivered the answer. So it's not like if we keep praying after God sends the answer that he's going to say, well, I'm not going to answer you now because you kept asking. In fact, this parable shows the opposite effect. If you get on his nerves a little bit, he may answer you more quickly. So we're dealing with the parable of the widow and the unjust judge. If you haven't figured that out yet, let's take a look. Now, we've talked about El Greco. He's one of our favorite painters, and he also painted this picture. At the Master System, we are always interested in the arts and literature, and that's why we're going to discuss this story. Now, some of you might wish that we had Cliff's Notes, but they didn't have those back then. What they had were called Luke's Notes, and Luke's notes are found right here. Here's his summary. He said, one day, Jesus told his disciples a story to show that they should always pray and never give up. Prayer works when we don't give up. But we're going to see that this widow is given an ample opportunity to do just that. Let's take a look. He begins, there was a judge in a certain city, he said, who neither feared God nor cared about people. So he is not going to answer her because he cares about her. Kind of like the friend who had the bread. It's not because of friendship. If God were going to do things for people just because he cared, then nobody would have any problems. Think about that. If God were going to do things for people just because he cared, then nobody would have any problems. Obviously, he doesn't answer us because he cares. He answers us because of importunity. Let's take a look. And a widow in that town kept coming to him, saying, give me justice against my adversary. For a while, he was unwilling. For a while, he was unwilling. But this widow, what she did is she kept coming. Like blind Bart, she cried out all the more. And that is the importunity motif. The importunity motif. We keep saying this, everyone who keeps on asking receives. Everyone who keeps on asking receives. And this widow is no exception. Let's take a look. But finally, he said to himself, I don't fear God or care about people, but this woman is driving me crazy. So the judge says, I don't care about people. Now, God never said that. Okay? This judge sort of represents him, but you have to understand the NLT is a little bit loose. It's a paraphrase. In the HCSB, the judge actually says, I don't respect man. Those are his words. And that does sound like something that God would say, because God is no respecter of persons. The lowest person on the totem pole, a defenseless widow, a blind beggar, they have just as much clout as some great person like a president or a king. You know, God is no more likely to answer King David than a lowly widow. That's what that means. So Judge Dreadful is definitely not impressed with this widow, but she is driving him crazy. Let's take a look. He says, I'm going to see that she gets justice because she is wearing me out with her constant requests. So Jesus is showing us why prayers get answered. So that word because is very important. It gives us the information we're seeking. She receives her answer because she wore him out with her constant requests. So William MacDonald points out, he says the judge was unmoved by the validity of her case. The fact that she was being treated unjustly did not move him to action on her behalf. Like this judge, God rules his kingdom with the scepter of divine principle, not with a bleeding heart. It is his principles. It is his principles, not his sympathies, which govern his kingdom. And the principle is this: everyone who keeps on asking receives. God is not moved by adverse circumstances. He is moved by constant requests. Great difficulties and pressing problems do not bring answers to prayer. Prayer brings answers to prayer. And not just prayer, but persistent prayer. It was her constant request that moved the judge. So let's take a look at our precept. One of my favorites, this is the squeaky wheel. And it simply says, as the squeaky wheel gets the oil, so the persistent asker receives her request. The judge said, this woman is driving me crazy. She wasn't just asking. She was squeaking and squealing like a rusty wheel. If he were going to leave her in her miserable plight, she had resolved to make his life miserable as well. So she wore him out with her constant requests. Never underestimate the power of persistent prayer. When Peter was arrested, the Bible says that constant prayer was offered to God for him by the church. The next thing you know, Peter was knocking at the gate. Constant prayer. It always works. So remember this. As the squeaky wheel gets the oil, so the persistent asker receives her request. You know, we talk about God is not moved by adverse circumstances. The children of Israel spent 400 years enslaved in Egypt. 400 years. And the hand of deliverance did not lift a finger to help them until their wheels started squeaking. Let's read from Exodus chapter 2, beginning there at verse 23. It says, now it happened in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. Then the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out. And their cry came up to God because of the bondage. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them. God did nothing until they raised the cry of the afflicted. Then he did four things. He heard, he remembered, he looked, and he acknowledged. He had planned their deliverance more than 400 years in advance, but he didn't kick that plan into motion until they began to squeak like a rusty wheel. So in some ways, at least, we have to admit that the Father of lights is similar to this judge. Let's take a look. Then the Lord said, "Learn a lesson from this unjust judge. Even he rendered a just decision in the end." So let's learn our lesson. There are times when God puts us off, but we should now know why we are grieved by various trials, why we suffer diverse temptations. It's so that the genuineness of our faith may be tested. Our faith, which is more precious to God than gold. If our faith is genuine, then it will stand the test of time. We will hold on to that request, keep waving it in front of his eyes until it gets answered. Now there are some similarities here, but there's also this contrasting effect. Even an uncaring, ruthless character did the right thing in the end. That's the idea. How much more would the Father of lights answer those who cry out to him? Nelson's commentary says it this way. It says, "The persistence of the widow is the lesson of the parable. If an insensitive judge will respond to the continual requests of a widow, God will certainly respond to the continual prayers of believers." And Jesus pretty much agreed with the commentator. Let's take a look. He continued, he said, "So don't you think God will surely give justice to his chosen people who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off?" So Jesus actually didn't say that God would never put us off. But he will not keep putting us off if we cry out to him day and night. That's the lesson. The psalmist said, "As for me, I will call upon God, and the Lord shall save me. The Lord shall save me. Evening and morning and at noon I will pray and cry aloud, and he shall hear my voice." It's like I said, if you get on his nerves a little bit, he may answer you more quickly. Let's take a look. Jesus said, "I tell you that he will swiftly grant them justice." So where else does Jesus actually guarantee a swift response? Although God may put us off for a while, when he sees our squeaky wheel faith, God will answer us speedily. That's the New King James word, speedily. Jesus finished, he said, "Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he find that faith on earth?" So it's like Jesus was looking into the future. And he says, wait a minute. They are not praying like that widow. Where is that faith? Where is squeaky wheel faith? He's not looking for just any kind of faith. He is looking for that faith. That faith which cannot be silenced. That faith which just keeps on coming. That faith which cries out day and night. That faith which squeaks, squeals, moans, begs, cries, weeps, wails, and makes any other kind of bothersome noise to let its driver know that it is in desperate need of oil. That faith never walks away empty-handed, because that faith refuses to walk away until it gets what it came for. And that faith is the whole purpose that God even hesitated in the first place. He would not for a while, so that you could show him that faith. When the Father of lights sees that faith, he will say, I have millions of prayers to answer, but I'm going to get to yours first because you have squeaky wheel faith. And I am always looking for that faith. We are looking for our next precept. This is our special theory of receiving, inspired by Einstein. It says, I'm no Einstein, but the special theory of receiving says, if you've raised your request to the higher power, and he doesn't answer you in the speed of lights, multiply your efforts. And this is a special type of faith that we use on special occasions, especially when you are in a desperate need of an answer. That's why the if is there. Okay, because we don't always pray like this, but there are times. There are times. So let's read it again. It says, I'm no Einstein, but the special theory of receiving says, if you've raised your request to the higher power, and he doesn't answer you in the speed of lights, multiply your efforts. So see if you can figure out that formula. Okay, there are 4 variables. So I want to know what each what does each letter represent? I also want to know, why is that request raised to the 4th power? See if you can figure that out and email the mastermind your answer. mastermind117207@gmail.com. mastermind117207@gmail.com. And the best response will receive a prize. In closing, there are different kinds of faith, and there are different methods. Okay, I find a lot of similarities here between the Syrophoenician woman's faith and this widow's faith. Persistent asking is a type of faith. And I never would have realized that until Jesus called it faith, really in both examples. So we'll call it squeaky wheel faith, or we will call it that faith. I also find a lot of similarities between Jesus' response to the Syrophoenician woman and the unjust judge's response to the persistent widow. Both cases started with some divine indifference. Okay, so if it takes a minute for God to answer, There are ways to overcome that initial indifference. Whether it was Mary asking for the wine, or the Syro-Phoenician woman asking for the deliverance, or this widow asking for justice. There was a way to overcome that initial indifference, and that way was to keep on asking. Just like it says in the Amplified Bible, Matthew 7:8, everyone who keeps on asking receives. Who is the one who receives? The one who keeps on asking. But there is this other verse, which says, a fool's voice is known by his many words. And my word count is rising as I speak. So we better stop here. Thanks for watching. We will see you next week.